It's 10 months until the next British general election, which is quite a short length of time, and it's quite interesting that all the parties are so close together less than a year out from the next election. Normally it is the case that one party is ahead, or that you generally have some idea about what's going to happen. For example, in 2009 nobody really thought that Gordon Brown would be re-elected whenever the next election was, which would have been 2010. Same with Tony Blair, you never really thought he would be defeated. Or a year before the 1997 election it was clear that Labour would win. But this is really the first time since the 1970s there's no clear party in the lead. It's all close. Well, currently Labour has a 3 to 4 point opinion poll lead, which is not as bad as it could be, but it's not as good as it could be either. It's sort of, it needs to be maintained, because of course Labour can come 2 percentage points behind the Conservatives in a general election and still gain more seats and be the largest party. Maybe not with a majority, but still the largest party. David Cameron's main aim as leader of the Conservative Party is to get a majority, and to do that he's going to need 40% of the vote or more to have the 326 seats he'll need to have a majority in Parliament. Of course he'll want to have 5 or 10 seats more than that to have a strong majority that won't be lost in by-elections, because that was the weakness of course John Major had, is that his majority got whittled right down due to rebellions and things and wrecked his whole government. So I think David Cameron's real aim in the election will be to get around 330 seats or more, which is a very, very long shot. No party has won 40% of the vote since the 2001 general election, when Labour got, I believe, about 40% or 41% of the vote. And the Conservatives have never got over 40% of the vote since 1992. And also that would then mean David Cameron would need to gain about 4 percentage points in a general election. Incumbent governments find it very hard to gain seats and gain percentage points in an election. The last time that happened was Harold Wilson in October 1974, and even so that only gained him, I think, 3 seats, which was not enough. Then of course Harold Wilson again in 1966 made big gains in a landslide in 1966, but he had the benefit of a good economy, a weak opposition leader, and the fact that Britain had just won the World Cup, or was about to win the World Cup, which made a great feeling of national pride. That's something that David Cameron is not really capable of, although he's charismatic and obviously looks prime ministerial because he's the Prime Minister. He's really lacked that kind of public optimism that Harold Wilson had when he increased his majority. So I think it's a very long shot for the Conservatives to actually gain seats in the next election, although on the other hand it's going to be difficult for Labour to gain many too, because although their policies are very popular, and although certainly when it comes to their cost of living agenda they really have been able to cut through with that, because the economy is recovering all the time, it's going to be a race as to whether before the election the economy does finally recover and people start to recover. I think that's quite a long shot. I think that really the government would need an extra 6 months to be able to cut through and win a majority, but they haven't got those extra 6 months, they've only got 10 months. When it comes to Liberal Democrats, a lot of their general view is that when it comes to the election their support will come back and they'll get 14 or 15% of the vote. I think that's unlikely, because of the fact that in a general election campaign people will just remember how good a leader Nick Clegg was last time and how bad he is now in comparison. I think a lot of people have really lost trust of them, and I don't think that will come back. Having said that though, when they've got seats that have got incumbent members of Parliament that tend to be popular with the electorate, they'll probably hold on to those seats, because the choice will either be Conservative or Labour, usually Conservative in those seats, so I think they could hold on to those. But when they've got MPs retiring, or they've got seats that are sort of very marginal, they will probably lose those. Which said that, it's of course interesting that Nick Clegg himself, his seat is Sheffield Hallam, which of course there's a university there, and that because of his reversal on tuition fees, it's perfectly possible that he could indeed lose his seat. Quite a big ask, but it's certainly possible that that could occur. Now, the other thing, the minor parties are going to be interesting because, of course, there is the UKIP factor. They'll probably, I think, go back down to 6 or 7% in a general election simply because their message won't really cut through in an election that will be about the economy, possibly about the NHS as well, and the welfare system. Then, of course, there is the EU referendum that they can certainly shout out their message on, but in a general election I think they'll struggle to hold on to seats, which, as they did the last time when they did really well in the European elections but dropped right down in the general election. They'll probably do better this time because they've got more publicity and they did even better in the European election, but I think they could struggle to win seats unless they really targeted select seats and they got really strong candidates, of which they don't really have that many. I think that they, at an absolute stretch, at 6 or 7%, and if there were some really interesting local factors, for example, places like port areas, Portsmouth, and of course Boston in Lincolnshire, which has got one of the highest proportions of immigrants that have come into that area, they might do particularly well and might come second or third, but I think they'll struggle to win any seats in the next general election, and I think they'll really just want to try to grab on to the edge of the cliff, as it were, to try and hold themselves up so that they might be able to, in the future, win seats. But I still think that's very unlikely. And having said that, Mr. Farage has said that if they fail to win any seats at all, he will resign as leader, and when he resigns as leader, I think it's inevitable that support for their party will probably plunge. The other smaller parties are also interesting because a lot of people have forgotten about George Galloway, who was elected as the Respect MP for Bradford in 2012 when he did really well in the by-election there. It would be interesting to see if he holds on at the next general election, because it is previously a safe Labour seat, and whether Labour might put in more resources into that in a general election, it's difficult to know exactly, because the Respect Party has over recent years simply become a George Galloway fan club, really, that Selma Yaqub and other prominent Respect Party leaders have left the party because it has just become George Galloway party, in the same way that UKIP has just become a Nigel Farage party. But if he does hold on, it will be interesting to see exactly what impact he has in the next Parliament. Also with the Greens, there was an opinion poll out of the Greens in Brighton Pavilion constituency, which is where Caroline Lucas has her constituency, to put the Greens 1 point behind Labour for holding that seat. It would be very interesting if the Greens did hold on to that seat, which I think they may do, because they might get support from Conservatives and Lib Dems that don't want Labour to win the seat, and also because the Greens certainly are doing well in a few other seats, although not quite across the country to the extent that the Lib Dems did and that UKIP has done. They've certainly done well in Norwich. They were polling at 20% in a seat in Norwich, and also in council elections as well. They did make some gains, so it would be interesting to see exactly what happens to them in the next Parliament. Also, for the really small parties, the nationalist parties, there would probably be a few SNP games in Scotland, I would think, but not many. And Plaid Cymru may gain a seat or two off Labour, possibly, but I would think that would be unlikely, and I think overall they would more or less stay the same in the next election. The next interesting thing about the election would be what the result is. I really currently think that no party will get more than 300 seats. I think they'll all just fall short of that. I think the Lib Dems will probably get about 30 to 35 seats, which would then make it interesting, because there is the possibility that if both Labour and the Conservatives get around 290 to 285 seats, and the Lib Dems get 35 seats, there would still not be any party that would have 326 seats, so that would be a really hung parliament because they would rule out a coalition. Of course, it's unlikely that both those parties would drop down quite so much, but it would be really interesting if that did happen, because that would then mean you'd need to bring in more parties into a coalition, and it would really trouble the Conservatives, because outside of the Lib Dems, the only parties that would be prepared to deal with them would be the Ulster Unionists, and they're incredibly Eurosceptic, and I don't think the Lib Dems would put up with having them in government either. So it would then favour Labour, because if they could get Plaid Cymru on their side, and if they could come to some kind of arrangement with the SNP and the Greens, they might be able to form an interim government until there will be another election. Another thing, if the Conservatives do fall slightly short, or 5 or 10 seats, is that they would probably be able to do a deal with the Ulster Unionists to form a government, but it would not last 5 years. Finally, the prediction that I would say is the most likely would be another hung parliament. I think that the Conservatives haven't got that kind of momentum and the kind of cut through with a popular leader and massively recovering economy they'd need to gain a majority, and I think the Lib Dems aren't going to have some kind of last minute breakthrough. I think they're more or less static at what they do. They might get up to 12 or possibly 13% in the general election, but not much more. But having said that, they'll hold on to a lot of their seats, but in seats that they're competing against, they will probably crash right down in terms of number of votes, largely to the benefit of Labour, possibly the Greens as well, and in the regions, of course, maybe to SNP and to Plaid Cymru as well. I think that the Labour Party doesn't really have that great sense of optimism it needs to win a majority, and neither does it have the kind of massively charismatic leader and the big move behind it to push them up into a majority in the same way, for example, that Harold Wilson did. He was a magnificent campaigner and really sort of cut through, and Ed Miliband doesn't really do that. Although he's a good leader, he's not a great leader. So I think the next election, the most likely outcome would be a Lib Dem Labour coalition, because I don't really think the Lib Dem activists would put up with another 5 years with the Conservatives. I think that would more or less doom their party in the same way it did after the First World War and as it did after the Second World War. You could say, with benefit of hindsight, that they should have learnt from history before they went into coalition.